Good afternoon.
Good afternoon.
Good afternoon, everybody. I want to welcome you to Capital Budgeting, a guide to creating. I'm Terry Tieman, and with me today, I'm joined by Evan Miller from Rehoboth Beach. I'm from Bethany Beach. In this session, we will be covering the capital budget and the capital plan. At GFOA best practices, developing a capital budget and a plan, and financing methods. So I'm going to turn this over to Evan and let him go from there.
Sure. Let me just find our presentation here.
Oh, okay. Yeah, that's important. We're novice presenters on a webcam or web platform. Bear with us. Okay, great, Evan.
All right. Yes. So good afternoon, everyone. As Terry had mentioned, today we're going to talk about capital budgeting, and we've sort of deemed the title of this presentation a guide to creating more than just a wish list, because I think a lot of the times capital budgets and capital improvement plans can start off as a wish list, especially if a municipality or organization hasn't created one once before. So to get started, the agenda, or what we'll cover today, again, just to recap, is what is a capital budget and a capital improvement plan, or CIP. Terry will also talk a little bit about GFOA best practices. We'll talk about developing a capital budget and CIP, and we'll bring in some examples, both that Terry and I have from our experience, and then talk about some financing methods as well, because at the end of the day, you can put together a plan for what you plan to purchase or the projects you plan to pursue, but funding it is obviously a critical component. So what is a capital budget? The capital budget reflects expenses in the fiscal year related to public capital improvements, and they include a number of things. First is infrastructure, so that includes your streets, storm drainage, water and sewer lines, other utility lines. There are some municipalities that have their own electric utility, wastewater treatment facilities, street lights, and also sidewalks as well. Public buildings are also an example of a public capital improvement. So that could be government offices, police and fire stations, community centers, and other public purpose structures. Equipment is also another capital improvement item that a lot of us think of when we think of a capital budget or a CIP. And that includes items that are large or costly, such as computers, vehicles, communication systems, and also machinery as well. And then finally, land acquisition can also be considered a capital improvement, and that would be the purchasing and preparing of land for construction or for parkland. A couple things here we wanted to mention was that a capital budget may be presented in the operating budget document, but it could also be presented in a separate document as well. How we generally present the capital budget here in the city of Rehoboth Beach is every department has a line item for a capital outlay. We also have a general budget summary spreadsheet, which includes the total capital outlay for the general fund and also the enterprise funds. And then we also have a 5-year CIP, which also includes a capital budget. Also, finally, one of the other things I wanted to mention was that a capital budget may have a limit on the amount or a threshold for an item to be considered a capital project. For example, some municipalities have a threshold of $25,000 where, in order to be considered a capital project, it has to exceed that amount. If not, it's just considered general maintenance or just an item that would go within a general budget or department expense. And then there's just a note there at the very bottom that engineering, design, studies, and pre-construction work can also be considered a capital expense. So as you'll see, infrastructure, public buildings, land acquisition, all three of those may involve engineering, design, studies, or pre-construction work. And when considering an asset, the cost of an asset, incorporating all of those things is important. So then what is a capital improvement plan, or a CIP? It's a multi-year forecast of major capital improvements, including, again, infrastructure, buildings, equipment, and land acquisition, as we talked about on the last slide. The forecast period is often for 5 years, although some CIPs cover shorter or longer periods of time. I've seen some municipalities that have done 3 years, other municipalities that have done up to 10 years. Certainly, though, going 10 years or out, it can be extremely difficult to forecast, but nonetheless, it's good to plan as far out as you can. The CIP also identifies not only future capital needs, but also the capital appropriations or the estimated spending required to address those needs. Also, the sources of capital financing and their impact on future operating budgets, which we will address a little bit later. The CIP is a plan in which the first year often becomes the capital budget for the year, the upcoming fiscal year. And the image on the right is just to depict that a CIP is a fluid document. It's always changing, especially during the development of a CIP. But over the course, every year as you continuously update your CIP, it's always fluid and it's always changing. So next, I'll turn it over to Terry.
Thank you, Evan. So the GFOA identifies 5 basic steps. You define the scope of your CIP or your capital plan. You determine the participants and prioritize the projects. You balance the CIP and connect it to your budget. You manage projects through the closeout of the project. Sometimes in a smaller community, this can be overlooked, and some larger communities that it can be also overlooked. But a very important part of it is managing through the project and documenting your progress. Capital, and then the last phase, capital asset maintenance and replacement. Let me see if I can switch. It's going to let me do it. Yay. So some GFOA best practices, Evan mentioned some of these and touched on some of these earlier, but the multi-year plan, it's usually 3 to 5 years. Capital planning policies, they recommend that governments develop a planning policy. Those policies, and some of this Evan touched on too, what constitutes a project. Debt obligations or borrowing for the project, acquisition or lease of land, purchase or major equipment and vehicles in excess of some dollar amount. Evan mentioned $25,000. That is, if you look at Dover, was their threshold. I don't know what it is now. When I worked there, it was $25,000. But when I worked in Fenwick Island, it was $2,500. So those thresholds change with the community, and it should be discussed with your finance department. It should be discussed with your finance committee, and you might want to talk to your auditors and your accountants because you set it for the appropriate size of your community. Constructions of new buildings can also constitute, or facilities, they can constitute what is a capital project. And Evan mentioned before, you include your engineering, your design, and other pre-construction costs. Sometimes that could be like a needs assessment. That could be capitalized. Major building improvements that are not routine expenses and that are substantially enhance the value. If you have to go in and remodel something, or you had to put up a new roof, or you had a major addition, that would all be considered, in some cases, capital projects. Major equipments or furnishings, major projects that are generally not reoccurring, like on a year in, year out basis. And like I said, what could also be included in there, I actually worked for a place that they included studies, major studies. So what could be considered a project. You may want to include due dates in your projects and project status reports as well. So again, just to reiterate, policies are established by each community to meet their needs. One community actually budgeted studies, as I said, and it probably doesn't meet accounting criteria, but it is what the community wanted, and it was a good way to track and account for that study. So additionally, best practices, environmentally responsible practices in capital planning. Not everything is about numbers, and sometimes you have to take into consideration, things that are qualitative versus quantitative. So communicating capital improvement strategies. It recommends that organizations develop communications plan for public participation. This is critical because you don't want to get a plan together and then publish it and go through all of the things that you have to go through to get the plan together, and then your public rejects it. It's important to bring the public along in an intermittent basis. So make sure that you're sticking with that. Let's see. The impact of capital projects on the operating budget. Many times you'll see communities, they budget for the capital plan, but then they don't put an impact on the operating budget in there. An example would be, you don't build a library and then think you're not going to have additional operating costs. And one of the other things to consider is that you might have a 2-story library. That brings additional costs. So when you're planning out your projects, you want to make sure that, whatever you're planning, you're looking at the operational costs that go along with it, because how you build your project can affect your operational costs. And then technology and capital planning and management. It recommends that finance officers take an organizational wide approach to this and use technology. It's not just about the finances. You have to know how that's going to affect the rest of your team, how a project is going to be impacted if you change the way you provide a service. Like if you add a drive-up window to a building, that is going to change the way you provide your services. So that might be great for finance. It might not be great for the customer service area, or it might entail adding additional people to service that window. So I think at this point, I'm going to turn this over. Oh no, I have a couple more. I didn't realize. Capital project monitoring. We mentioned this a little bit earlier, but a critical part of your capital plan is monitoring your projects. And I've been in front of too many councils that get surprised when a project's not on task or it's been delayed. And this is critical right now because of the what COVID brings to it. You could be waiting on supplies. You could be waiting on an order that just hasn't made it in, or believe me, if it has something to do with a chip, it might delay your project, a computer chip. And long-term financial planning. One of the things that I highly recommend is that capital plans are usually for 5 years, but you may want to do your financial planning out like maybe 7 years, so that you can see, are you going to be able to afford debt service payments and then another debt service payment, or how are you going to structure the resources that go, or the revenue that's going to pay for this? So, and do you want, or are you going to need a tax increase at some point along the line? All things to consider when you're looking at developing a capital plan and you're looking at your financing strategy, which I think we'll get into a little bit later. Mm-hmm. I think next Evan's going to go through. I may have advanced that one more, Evan.
Yeah, no worries. So yeah, the next thing we wanted to go into was sort of the process of developing a capital budget and a capital improvement plan. So I wanted to talk a little bit about my experience with the city of Rehoboth Beach. So really developing the capital budget and the CIP is part of the annual budget process, as you would expect. Department heads are the ones who really know what their needs are. So typically the department heads, they prepare their budget requests, and then they're also preparing their capital budget requests. The city manager then will meet with the department heads and analyze those requests. So typically we meet individually with each department head and we review not only their operating budget, but also their capital budget as well. We address any capital projects that may not have been completed in the current fiscal year or won't be completed in the current fiscal year, and then also analyze the future requests as well. During that process, or after that process, the city manager, finance director, and myself, we prepare the annual budget, which again includes the capital budget, and also the 5-year capital improvement plan documents. And those are the documents that have been vetted internally by the department heads, again, finance director, city manager, myself, and are ready to be presented to our board of commissioners. We then hold our budget meetings with the board of commissioners, which can take anywhere from 5 to 6 meetings. And during that process, the documents are tweaked with every meeting. During that time, the commissioners may ask additional questions about each capital project. They may want to add particular projects to the list, or just request information in general. And during that process, the capital budget is adjusted based on available revenues and other requests. So it's, again, a fluid document that continues to change with every meeting. And then ultimately, after all those meetings, the budget is adopted. During that process, too, the budget meetings, we obviously have a lot of public input as well. So by the time the budget's adopted, we've had a lot of opportunities to get input from the elected body, but also from the department heads and the public. So there's, support behind the budget that's being passed. I wanted to touch a little bit more about the role of all of those who are involved in the capital budget and CIP, what their roles are. So first, the role of department heads. Again, the requests or the needs really start with the department heads. So they identify their potential projects, and that's when I say enter the wish list. That's when you get a list of all projects that tend to be front-loaded a little bit. And during that process, they also need to provide justification for each project and, if possible, identify sources of funding. So they may be aware of grants or other opportunities that are out there to fund their particular projects. In some cases, too, they may be aware of a item that was in the capital budget but is not going to be pursued in the current fiscal year for a variety of different reasons, and that those funds could be used, to purchase an item from the current fiscal year that might have been planned for in the following fiscal year. They then present their requests again to the city manager and the board of commissioners. We typically have the department heads come in and do a presentation as to why they need particular items, and it gives the board and the public as well the opportunity to ask questions. And then they ultimately execute on the approved projects. The role of the city manager is to initiate the development of the annual budget, including the capital budget and CIP. This usually starts with a memo that goes out to all the department heads, notifying them of a date where they need to submit their proposed budget. After that date, we then begin to meet with the department heads and analyze or vet those requests internally. The city manager meets with the finance director to balance the budget, and that's before it goes before the board of commissioners and the public. We present that budget and the CIP to the board of commissioners, and again, during that process, we'll get additional requests for information, changes, and then upon approval, the city manager will request regular status updates from the department heads, which goes back to a point that Terry mentioned earlier about monitoring and reporting. Continuously following up on the capital budget and just, updating the commissioners or the public body on what's happening. And then finally, the role of the elected body, in our case, the Board of Commissioners. They review and discuss the capital budget and CIP at periodic intervals designated by the mayor. Again, that can be here anywhere from 5 to 6 meetings. Again, this discussion usually does produce additional requests or requests for additional information, which is then brought before them again at the next meeting. And then also during this process, they discuss revenue sources that are going to fund these expenditures. And some examples may include changes to taxes or fees. And really that's done at their level, certainly with guidance from us. And then finally, they approve the annual budget and the CIP. So I also wanted to talk about our process in developing the first capital improvement plan here at the city of Rehoboth Beach. So one of the what the process that we had used when we first started was using a capital project request form. And the intent of using a request form is that you better vet through some of the potential projects that are considered to be more wish list items, and you can better identify what the project is, the urgency behind it, and the justification behind it. So the request form was something that was distributed to all of the department heads during the development of the budget early on. The form, and there's a screenshot there to the right-hand side, basically included a title of the project, a detailed project description that justified the expenditure for the period proposed, a range in which the project would need completed, so whether it needed to be done 1 to 2 years, 3 to 4 years, or beyond 5 years, or even recurring annually. It also included a project priority, which we thought was very helpful, not only internally, but also at the board level, at the commissioner level. And that could be something that's essential, so it's needed yesterday, something that is desirable, so it's needed, but it can wait a year or two, and then deferrable, which is something more of a wish list. It can wait, 3 or 4 years until it's done. And obviously, as if you were to prepare a request form, you can tweak, the range in which the project would be needed, or the priority, however you see fit. There was also, of course, an estimated cost for the project. And again, something that Terry had mentioned earlier in the presentation, an annual recurring cost. And that annual recurring cost could be something associated with maintenance or a fee, or also just any overall impact on the operating budget moving forward. And then finally, a proposed funding source. Again, the department head may be aware of possible funding sources used to procure that item. Again, just continuing on here and developing our first capital improvement plan. So after the budget was approved, so we went through that whole process of vetting through all of those capital items, taking a look at the range in which the projects were needed, the available funds, the expenditures, and plotting out 5 years. The next thing we did was prepare the final 5-year capital improvement plan document. And the intent behind this document was to make it really a user-friendly document where anybody who was to look at this document and didn't know what a capital improvement plan was or a capital budget was, or even if they didn't know anything about the city of Rehoboth Beach, they could get a firm understanding of what exactly was going on. So within that CIP, it first started off with a description of what is a capital improvement plan. So going back to the definition we talked about earlier in the presentation, talked a little bit about how it was prepared. So what is sort of the timeline in which we follow in order to develop and approve a capital improvement plan. We talked in there about the role of each group. So again, the role of the department head, the role of the city manager, the role of the elected officials. We talked about certain criteria that would be used to prioritize projects, both internally and also at the board level. We also included the capital project requesters. So that's essentially all of your departments that would request a capital item. So it was a list of who they were and a brief, 1 or 2 sentence description of the services that they provide to the city. We had included in one iteration of our CIP any special implications on the capital budget or the CIP. So for example, in one of our latest iterations, we talked about the implications of COVID-19. We were getting ready to go towards budget adoption, and COVID had hit, and suddenly we had to make a lot of changes to our plans for the capital budget and the CIP. We removed a few items, we deferred a few items, we held on some items to see what our revenue looked like at the end of the summer. So there was just a brief, 1 or 2 pages describing what that process entailed and why we had done what we did. Then, of course, we include a screenshot of our capital budget. Again, it was a separate document, and then the 5-year CIP. And then we went into capital project description sheets, which you can see a screenshot on the right of what they were. And again, photos, more photos. As much information as you can provide, the better. And we found that photos are extremely helpful for the public and also the elected officials with knowing exactly what we're planning to procure. So if it's a tractor or if it's a piece of equipment, having a picture of it helps them better understand. Or if it's a serious maintenance issue, having a picture of the maintenance that needs to be done, or just the current status of a particular building or anything like that. Photos are just extremely helpful. And in those description sheets, you can see it again. It includes the project title, what department it falls under, a description. It includes the proposed financing. So over the 5-year period, what are the costs associated with either design, maintenance, construction? Is there a feasibility assessment or study being done? And then at the very bottom, the funding source. Document then also at the very end touched on funding strategies, which Terry and I will get into. And then lastly, it was a timeline for adoption of the CIP and essentially when the annual budget cycle starts again. And I've linked the 5-year CIP on this slide here. So finally, now I just wanted to touch on our process now. So now that we've established a 5-year capital improvement plan, what is our process for maintaining that? So again, it really starts during the initial budget planning phase. So essentially, before any of the department heads sit down with the city manager to review the proposed budget, we give them a copy of the 5-year CIP from the current fiscal year. They then look through that 5-year CIP. They're looking particularly at the second year in the CIP because the first year, as you'll recall, is the current capital budget. So they'll look at the second year, they'll plan for the second year to become their capital budget, and then add a fifth year as well. And again, forecast out, they'll add projects, defer projects, or eliminate projects altogether. They then input their capital budget, not the 5-year capital improvement plan, but just the capital budget into our financial software. I've added a screenshot again to the right, which basically shows budget detail of a particular department. So here, this is our parking meter department. Towards the bottom, you can see quantity, unit cost, and total. So you can break out the unit cost, the quantity of the items that you're purchasing, and then off the right-hand side, there's a description and justification. So the department heads do all of that prior to the budget meetings with the finance director and the city manager. And then again, the CIP just continues to remain a fluid document throughout the entire budget process as we have our meetings with the Board of Commissioners. Again, it just continues to change and remains fluid. So that is how we maintain the CIP right now. I think really the initial challenge can be setting up your 5-year CIP. Once you have an approved 5-year CIP, really updating it is not as difficult as first setting up your 5-year plan. And next,
Oh, thank you, Evan. One of the things that I just want to touch on before some of these documents are summary documents, but before we get to that, I just wanted to say it can be very cumbersome to handle a CIP plan in terms of administrating it. And one of the some of you will have enterprise solutions that do this. For those of you that don't, you may want to look, and I'm not advertising for this, but when I was in Dover, and I believe that they're still using it, I just took a look at their capital plan, and it looks like they're still using the same software package. It's a package called Planet software, PLANIT, and it's kind of a database that separates all this stuff. It does it, if you have a project that requires funding from the general fund, the water fund, and maybe the sanitation fund or whatever, multiple funds across multiple years, can be difficult to keep track of all that. And so this does a very good job of handling that. Again, you may want to take a look at it if you're actually thinking about putting in a capital plan, but kudos to Rehoboth for doing their capital plan. And I just wanted to mention that Rehoboth won the GFOA Distinguished Budget Presentation Award, of which capital planning is a component, as a criteria. So kudos to Rehoboth Beach for succeeding in doing that. It's really great. And I think, Alvin, you were a big part of that project. So congratulations to you guys.
Thank you.
So moving on, this is a CIP source and use of funds. This came from Dover. As some of you may know or not know, I worked 23 years in Dover doing their budgets and their capital plans. In this particular report, what you see is it's a list of all the major projects, and this is just one page of it down the left side. And then across the top are all the funding sources on the top. It provides an at-glance look at all the resources needed and where they're coming from. So it's a nice tool to have, and it's a good summary tool to present so that council can get like a big picture of what is really going on in your capital plan. Then the next one is a total city summary, again from Dover, because, and this is one of the reports that is generated by that software. The total city summary goes by fund: general, water, wastewater, electric, and then a list of all the revenue sources involved in that, and it takes it out 5 years. One of the things I wanted to mention here is, one of the things you should try to do in a 5-year plan or a 3-year plan is to smooth it so that you're not spending, you don't see spikes in your spending. That because you may have revenue resources that are coming in year after year, so you want to try to smooth that. You can smooth projects a lot of times by deferring projects. Never popular with department heads, I can assure you, but sometimes necessary. Or you can phase projects. You might, if you have a major project, you might do planning for it in 1 year. You might do planning for it in 2 years, actually, and then you might do, design work, and then you might do the actual build in 3 or 4. So that helps spread the cost across years more evenly than if you just say, oh, we're gonna do a $50 million improvement to our power plant or whatever. Um, the other thing to consider when you're building your CIP, and can't remember, Evan, if you touched on it or not, is, be careful how many projects you plan. You have a staff that is limited, and you're also consultants that are limited. Be realistic about what you think they can accomplish. I have built CIP capital plans for many times, and we didn't meet goals because we had limited staff. We couldn't get everything done. And you know your staff, you know what you're capable of. So take time to think about what you can actually do. It may be, and some smaller communities, their staff is limited. Even in larger communities, most of my experience comes from Dover. I've seen that and especially now with COVID, you are having staffing challenges, all kinds of things. So be realistic about what you can accomplish. Um, the last page is another summary page that Dover used. We used when I was there. That lists project numbers. Some places have project numbers. We did. It tells you about the project, and then it goes on to talk about the budget, the latest estimate of the budget, year to date spent, and then the last column is, percentage complete. Is the program ongoing? Are you waiting on something? So this is always presented to in our monthly report to our council when we took it, so that they have an idea about what is happening. Maybe a project isn't completed or isn't even started because of some timing issues. So we put all that out there. I believe in a policy, after many years of doing this, of no surprises to your council. It is not something you want to go to them at the end of the year and say, oh, we never got started on this project. They should know that way before it comes time to rebudget it for the next year. And one thing I did want to mention is sometimes you will find the capital budget and the capital plan, it's actually legislated, and that will either be found in the charter or the code. I've only seen one example of this, but it does occur, and it can be a legal process. This is Newark. Newark's, I think it's their code where how they submit it. It's similar process to what Evan said, but it's just legislated. So just be aware that different communities have different requirements. I've seen that for the budget. Most places do legislate how to do a budget, but this is the first time I've ever seen it in a capital plan. So I just wanted to include that. Again, every community is different, and they tailor these things to their own needs. But there are some generally accepted accounting things that from GFOA where you try to follow that, and there's just best practices. So I'm going to turn it back over to Evan.
Sure, thanks, Terry. So finally, what we wanted to hit on was some of the financing methods for financing a capital budget and CIP. So the ones that we'll touch on are cash, so using current revenues or current resources or cash reserves, pay-go. Debt, certainly, so bonded indebtedness, so general obligation bonds, revenue bonds, private offerings, state revolving loans, and also through the USDA. There's also capital lease obligations and then inter-fund loans. So there's, again, it's sort of borrowing from another fund. So enterprise fund may be contributing towards the general fund. Finally, grants and then public-private partnerships. So to briefly touch on cash, and for each one, we'll just hit on briefly the pros and cons of each. So the pros of using cash, it improves your financial condition, so you can identify, what your anticipated revenues are, and then better plan for your expenditures based on what you're planning on for your revenues. And a lot of the revenue sources, you can look back historically and see typically what you brought in and better plan for what you will expend based on those revenues. There's no borrowing costs associated with cash, so you don't have to pay interests on any loans. There's no or little procedural or approval requirements, which expedites the purchase of less expensive or recurring capital assets. So unlike loans or borrowing, you don't have to go before the public for a referendum, or you don't have to go seek approval for the elected body for loans. And then finally, it preserves flexibility in future operating budgets for the cash that can be used again in the future for other capital related purchases.
Okay.
The cons is that it does misallocate some of the costs of major capital assets that have very long useful lives. So Terry talked a little bit about budget smoothing. If you have a major capital asset that requires significant funding for, if you were to pursue a cash option for that, you're paying for all of it up front in order to get that capital project completed. So you don't really have the benefits of the smoothing effect paying for that over multiple years. And then finally, using cash does result in opportunity costs. So that cash that you use for one particular project can't be used for other items or other things within the budget itself.
Well, are you there now? All right. Well, why don't I run over there now so that you're there in case I have any questions?
Just to talk a little bit about debt as a financing method. The pros of using debt as a financing method is that you retain your cash reserves for alternate or future uses. Your municipal debt is typically tax exempt with low borrowing costs. You get to spread the cost over the useful life of the asset, which means that, and your debt service payments to people that are actually using these resource, whether it's a building or a facility or a power plant or a treatment plant, they are the ones paying for that asset. So you charge users of infrastructure appropriately. Then in the cons, the impacts are it affects your balance sheet, and it's going to affect your debt ratio. It's the transactional cost. You have a bond counsel. You have to prepare the bond to be issued. You've got to hold a lot of times referendums. So, and the borrowing costs, as I just mentioned. Then procedural and approval requirements. Like there can be covenants. You may be required to set up a reserve that you have to reserve so much of your revenue every year in order to qualify for the bond. And certainly your debt capacity. I've worked for a couple communities where their debt capacity was at maximum, and there was no room to borrow. Unfortunately, we were able to refinance, and at that point, we improved our debt capacity, and were able to go out and issue additional debt to make improvements that were needed to their water sewer system. So those are the things that you think about with debt. It's more complicated, but sometimes it's very appropriate to use it. I will say, if you're going to issue debt, bond rating agencies are going to look at whether you're comfortable with raising revenue. So if you haven't raised taxes in a long time, or you haven't raised your water fees in a long time, or your electric or your fees, bond rating agencies will look at that and say, this community is not willing to make those increases, and they may not be willing to make the increases to pay their debt. So those are all things that you think about as you're making decisions about what kind of financing to use. So I think, Evan, you want to do the next one. You're still controlling it.
Sure. So grants is a financing method, which I'm sure we all have some experience with. So the pros obviously are reduced costs, which then free up funds that could be used for other projects. Another pro is that once the grants are received, you may be more likely to receive others, especially if there is an organization that gives out grants maybe quarterly. Successfully receiving those grants and providing any of the reporting requirements or anything like that on time, and ensuring that you met all the requirements stipulated in the grant agreement. Again, you're more likely to receive those funds for future grants. It can also, again, increase the funds available towards a project, which enlarging the scope. There's one particular project that I can think of if you were to have a certain amount of funds and you go out and you seek a grant and you use those funds as a match, you could potentially double the cost, contributed to a particular project and enlarging the scope. Some of the cons of grants is, again, depending on the award amounts, the application process may just not be worth the time and energy. I've been in some situations where, the grant amount is just so minimal, but the reporting requirements or the application process is just way too time consuming or requires a lot of work to be done, that it's just really not worth the time to put in. There can also be some burdensome reporting requirements or strings attached. You may just be required to provide constant reports updating on the progress of the grant, or just generally at the end of the grant, significant document that's submitted as a final deliverable. You may come across limited eligibility. So depending on, it could be the size of your municipality, the makeup of your municipality, that ultimately will impact your ability to seek out grants. Competition can also be very fierce for grants. I'm sure we experience that a lot in Delaware. Depending on what the grant is funding, and how aware other organizations are of that grant, again, the competition could be fierce for those funds. Also, it can take time to be approved and receive funds. So if you want to pursue a project, you apply for a grant and they don't make an award decision until 6 months from then, it may just be too late, and you need to decide whether you pursue the project on your own or you wait and find out whether or not the award was granted. And then finally, grants are short term. So they're, for the most part, not long term. The most that I've seen is that a grant will extend approximately 2 years. So something just to think of as you consider grants as a financing method.
So I think one of the things that I don't have a lot of experience in, I have some recent experience in it, is a P3 or public-private partnership as a financing method. The pros of this is it gives great integration with the community or surrounding area. It's innovative most of the time. There are cost savings, tremendous cost savings for both measure partnering for both entities, and also time savings. But there are cons and risk involved, like this demand stability, policy stability. Like, is it going against your policy? It might require you to make some changes in in certain policies if it's a partnership for certain things, subject to the quality of the agreement. This is really critical because there is no real form or method to do it. Every project is different, and governments are not typically in good students of other businesses. We are not familiar with that kind of the partnerships business. So it can be difficult to get a good agreement, and monitoring capacity, that can be difficult too, because you at the mercy of your partner, whoever that is. So that, I just wanted to mention that it's not something that you see often in smaller communities, but we see it all the time in very large communities or towns or cities. Okay, Evan, I think. Let's see. Capital financing strategies. I wanted to mention this because capital financing involves major decisions and long-term commitments, and they need to be as deliberate as your CIP process. So whatever your financing strategy is, it should promote financial strength and flexibility. It should limit the cost of acquisition while meeting community needs, and it should strengthen local government standing with bond rating agencies, investors, and community stakeholders. I guess I need to. Okay, so some of the suggestions, and this was from a book from the International City County Managers Association, but I think they're really great suggestions, is adopt financial policies to guide capital financing. Monitor financial condition on an ongoing basis. Some of these we've already touched on, but it's a great checklist and reminder. Prepare a multi-year financial forecast for major funds. Fund less expensive capital assets from the operating budget. Maintain adequate fund balances. Create and fund capital reserves. So many times I've seen this done in my work in the last several years. I've seen, we get transfer tax. Transfer tax is is not stable. We're doing very well with transfer tax right now, but I've seen some years where transfer tax, you got half of what you projected, and trying to budget it and project it on an ongoing basis is very difficult. But I've seen a lot of communities use transfer tax to balance their operating budgets. Not a good idea. So set up reserves for that could be a great source of revenue for as a capital reserve. So just my pontification after so many years of doing this and being frustrated that people use those funds for those those transfer funds for things other than capital projects. Determine and remain within your debt capacity. Like I said, I've worked for a community that they lost track of their debt capacity. They were actually over it when I went there, and we were able to refinance and move some things around, and we were meeting our charter. Select suitable debt options for capital projects and acquisitions. Balance pay as you go and debt financing. Pay-go is great, but not everyone is going to have enough cash or reserves to pay as you go. And again, you saw the pros and cons of each. Effectively plan, sell, and manage debt. Maintain or improve your bond rating. And again, a lot of that goes to, are you willing to set rates and make them cover your cost? These are all things that and sound financial principles that bond rating agencies are going to look at. Use subsidies to attract private investment. Fund infrastructure to support economic development. Seek federal and other intergovernmental grants. If there's one of the things that we're talking about here lately is all the bipartisan infrastructure law. And there are going to be many, many grants for that. If you do not have a good relationship with a grant writer, or you don't have a grant writer on staff, I would suggest that you get one. Or you don't have a consultant that can write grants for you. I think it'd be good to go out there and look for that now. Take advantage of interlocal arrangements. One of the things that being in a coastal community, Evanstown and my town, and some of the people on this webinar, looking at, we have an association of coastal towns, and that can be very helpful when you're all working together toward the same goal. So take advantage of those where you see them, and there are opportunities out there everywhere. And I think that is the end. Or no, one more slide. We need to thank our sponsors. So please, thanks to the sponsors. And I want to say this is a great opportunity. It's the first time that we've had a webinar, an annual conference. And I want a big shout out to Anne Marie and her team, Melody, and everybody for putting this together. I'm very appreciative of it. And this kind of opportunity hopefully continues in the future. So I guess I don't see any questions in the chat box, and we're happy to answer any if you have any questions. Have anything else, Evan?
No, that's all I have. I also want to thank Anne-Marie and Melody for helping lead these efforts and for the opportunity to present.
Yep. So I hope you found the information helpful, and Evan, I don't think we put our contact information up here. We probably should have, but most people know how to get a hold of me. If you don't, it's just tieman@townofbethanybeach.com. I'm happy to answer any questions or send you, copies of anything you might want.
Yeah, likewise. And if our contact information isn't provided in the platform under the speakers, my email address is just emiller@cityofrehoboth.com. Also happy to answer any questions.
So, any questions now? We're happy to answer them if we can figure out how to get in the chat. I think we've got 2 areas.
I don't see anyone in the chat.
I don't either.
All right.
So, I guess we can say goodbye, right?
Yep. Thank you all. Thank you for attending.
Thank you.